You know what's funny about galactic politics? Nobody ever expects the humans to have a plan. I mean, really, nobody. The Zephyrians think we're violent primates who somehow stumbled into faster-than-light travel by accident. The Kethmori believe we're chaos incarnate wrapped in opposable thumbs. And the Veltar? Well, they think we're adorable little murder monkeys who make excellent pets if you can house-train us not to bite the furniture. All of which made Ambassador Daniel Cross's current situation particularly amusing. If you enjoy watching a room full of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations collectively lose their shit. Let me get this straight, rumbled Counselor Thexvar of the Kethmori hegemony, his voice carrying that special tone reserved for explaining obvious things to particularly slow children. You want us to give you the species that somehow managed to weaponize music, administrative control over the neutral zone? Cross leaned back in his chair, which was designed for something with 3 times as many joints as humans possessed, and somehow made it look comfortable. That's the proposal, yes. The Galactic Council chamber fell into what you might generously call stunned silence. If stunned silence typically involved the sound of 17 different species all making their various versions of "Are you fucking kidding me" noises simultaneously. Counselor Zixthala of the Zephyrian Confederacy was the first to recover. Her crystalline features literally sparkled with what Cross had learned to recognize as barely contained laughter. Human Cross, surely you jest. Your species has been part of the galactic community for exactly 47 standard years. The youngest member races typically wait at least 3 centuries before proposing to manage so much as a parking orbital. And yet, Cross said, maintaining that particular human expression that could mean anything from genuine friendliness to barely restrained homicidal intent, and which, crucially, no alien species had yet learned to distinguish between. Here we are. Now, let me pause the story here to explain something about the neutral zone, because it's kind of important to understand why everyone thought Cross had suffered some sort of catastrophic head injury. The neutral zone wasn't just any old patch of space. It was the patch of space, a region roughly the size of a small galaxy where 14 different major powers had drawn their borders so close together that nobody could sneeze without causing 3 separate diplomatic incidents and at least 1 trade war. It was where the galaxy's most volatile species came to glare at each other across artificial boundaries and occasionally have the sort of cultural exchanges that typically involved battle fleets and obituaries. Managing the neutral zone was the sort of job that required the diplomatic finesse of a Veltar meditation master, the strategic thinking of a Kethmori war planner, and the sheer bloody-minded persistence of a... well, actually that last part was pretty much human territory. Which might explain why Cross wasn't backing down. The neutral zone, continued Counselor Aleksandra of the Veltar Collective, her harmonious voice carrying just a hint of the psychic pressure that made most species immediately want to agree with whatever she said, requires delicate handling. It is a region where the slightest miscommunication can result in system-wide conflicts. Cross nodded thoughtfully. Right. The sort of place where you need someone who's really good at improvising when everything goes to hell. The silence that followed was the sort that typically precedes either enlightenment or explosions. High Counselor Yith Garen of the Nexari Dominion, who served as the rotating chair of the council, and had the thankless job of keeping everyone from literally tearing each other apart during meetings, finally spoke up. Human Cross, perhaps you could explain the logic behind this proposal. Happy to, Cross said, and somehow managed to make those 2 words sound both cheerful and mildly threatening. See, the way I figure it, you've got 14 major powers, all staring at each other across the zone, right? And for the past 6 centuries, your approach has been to very carefully manage every single interaction, mediate every dispute, and generally try to keep everyone playing nice. A time-tested approach, Zixthala said stiffly. Sure, Cross agreed. Time-tested and failing spectacularly. You've had 47 major conflicts in the past decade alone. The Kethmori and Zephyrian trade routes are so tangled up in regulatory disputes that cargo ships need a legal team just to plot a course. And don't even get me started on what happened when the Veltar tried to establish those meditation retreats in Sector 7. Several counselors shifted uncomfortably. The Sector 7 meditation incident was not discussed in polite company, mostly because it had somehow resulted in 3 different species discovering new forms of enlightenment, 2 minor trade wars, and 1 very confused cargo ship full of what could only be described as weaponized serenity. Your point being? Yith Garen asked, though something in his tone suggested he was beginning to suspect where this was going and didn't much like it. My point, Cross said, is that your careful, diplomatic, time-tested approach assumes that everyone involved is going to act rationally. And with all due respect to the distinguished counselors present, that's about as likely as a Nexari learning to tell jokes. The Nexari delegation went very still. This was their equivalent of humans turning bright red and making sputtering noises, except significantly more dangerous because Nexari had a tendency to express extreme emotion through localized gravitational anomalies. Furthermore, Cross continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that the space around the Nexari seats was beginning to bend light in interesting ways. Your approach requires that everyone involved actually wants things to run smoothly, which frankly they don't. Explain, Thexvar rumbled. The Kethmori profit from controlled chaos in the shipping lanes. The Zephyrians use the regulatory complexity to maintain their monopoly on crystal-based navigation systems. The Velatar have turned the whole situation into the galaxy's most expensive group therapy session. And the Nexari? Cross paused, looking directly at Ythgarin. Well, the Nexari just enjoy having a problem that can't be solved with mathematics. The gravitational disturbance around the Nexari delegation intensified slightly, which was either a sign of offense or the precursor to someone becoming a small, very dense object. It was hard to tell with Nexari. So what exactly are you proposing? Aleksandra asked, her harmonious voice carrying just a hint of psychic static that suggested she was less than perfectly centered. Cross smiled. It was the sort of smile that had probably looked perfectly reasonable to whoever had first taught humans to make fire, right up until everything started burning. Simple, he said. You give us administrative control of the neutral zone, and we'll make it work. How? Zixthala demanded. By doing what we do best, Cross said. Pissing everyone off equally until they're more interested in complaining about us than fighting with each other. The silence that followed this statement was so complete that you could have heard a quark decay. Finally, Councillor Brickstell of the Minor Harathi delegation spoke up. The Harathi were known for their pragmatic approach to galactic politics, which mostly consisted of staying out of everyone else's way and occasionally offering to sell them insurance. That might actually work. Brickstell, Ythgarin said in the tone of someone whose day had just gotten significantly more complicated. No, think about it, Brickstell continued, warming to his theme. The humans are already universally considered unpredictable, potentially dangerous, and completely unreasonable. If you put them in charge of the zone, everyone would be so busy trying to figure out what the humans are planning that they wouldn't have time to fight with each other. That's a terrible plan, Thexvar pointed out. Is it worse than the current situation? Brickstell asked. The counselors looked around at each other, clearly running through mental calculations involving casualty figures, economic losses, and diplomatic headaches. It might actually be better, admitted Zixthala, sounding slightly horrified by her own words. Cross, meanwhile, was doing his best to look like someone who hadn't just convinced a room full of advanced alien civilizations to seriously consider putting the galactic equivalent of a pyromaniac in charge of the ammunition depot. Of course, he said casually. We'd need certain guarantees. And there it was, the moment when everyone realized that the harmless-looking human might have been playing chess while they were all still trying to figure out checkers. What sort of guarantees? Ythgarin asked, in the tone of someone who knew he was probably going to regret asking. Full administrative authority within the zone. No interference from council oversight committees. Complete autonomy in dispute resolution. And, Cross paused for effect, unrestricted access to all trade and navigation data for the region. The silence was back, but this time it had a distinctly calculating quality to it. You're asking for unprecedented authority, Aleksandra said slowly. I'm asking for the tools to do the job, Cross corrected. You can't expect us to manage a region we don't have complete information about. Thexvar leaned forward, his massive frame making the reinforced furniture creak ominously. And what assurance do we have that humanity won't simply use this authority to serve your own interests? Cross looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Why would we want to serve our own interests? Because that's what species do, Zixthala said, as if explaining something obvious to a child. Right, Cross said. But see, that assumes we have interests that conflict with yours, which we don't. Explain. Think about it. What do humans want from the neutral zone? We don't have significant trade routes through the region. We don't have territorial claims. We're not trying to expand our sphere of influence or establish strategic footholds. We're just... Cross shrugged. We're just here. It was, several of the counselors realized, a disturbingly good point. Furthermore, Cross continued, serving our own interests would require us to have a coherent long-term strategy, which frankly we don't. We're much better at making things up as we go along. That's not reassuring, Ythgarin pointed out. No, Cross agreed cheerfully, but it is honest. And honesty, as any good diplomat will tell you, is absolutely terrifying in politics. Councillor Vextar of the Synthesis Coalition, a relatively minor power that mostly specialized in making other species feel guilty about their carbon footprints, cleared her throat. Human Cross, let us assume for a moment that the Council were to approve this proposal. How exactly would you manage the neutral zone? Cross leaned forward slightly, and for just a moment something shifted in his expression. Something that suggested that maybe, just maybe, the affable human diplomat knew exactly what he was doing. Well, he said, first we'd establish a central administrative station. Nothing fancy, just a base of operations. Then we'd start implementing what we call creative problem solving. Which involves what exactly? Making up rules as we need them, ignoring the ones that don't work, and generally treating the whole thing like the universe's most complicated improvisation exercise. The assembled counselors tried to process this approach to galactic administration. That sounds like chaos, Thexvar rumbled. Controlled chaos, Cross corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Sure. Chaos is when everything goes wrong at random. Controlled chaos is when everything goes wrong according to plan. Aleksandra's harmonious voice carried a note of what might have been fascination. And you believe this approach would be effective? I believe, Cross said, that the current approach isn't working, and when something isn't working, the best solution is usually to try something completely different. Even if that something is insane, especially if it's insane. Sanity is overrated in politics. High Counselor Ythagarin looked around the chamber, taking in the expressions of his fellow counselors. Confusion, concern, and, perhaps most troubling of all, genuine curiosity. The Council, he said carefully, would need time to consider this proposal. Of course, Cross said. Take all the time you need. It's not like the zone is going anywhere. He paused, then added with the sort of casual delivery that suggested he'd been saving this particular bombshell for exactly the right moment. Oh, and you should probably know, Earth has already begun preliminary preparations for zone administration, pending Council approval. The silence that followed this statement was the sort that typically precedes either spontaneous applause or spontaneous combustion. You did what? Zixthala's crystalline features went through several colors that didn't exist in human visible spectra. Preliminary preparations, Cross repeated helpfully. Nothing major. Just some basic logistical planning, personnel assignments, that sort of thing. Personnel assignments, Ythagarin said slowly. Well, you can't expect to manage a region that size with just one person. We've got a whole team standing by. Administrators, negotiators, technical specialists. Cross smiled that dangerous smile again. Even a few military advisors, just in case. Several counselors made noises that suggested their respective species' version of choking. Human Cross, Thexvar said in a voice that suggested he was working very hard to remain calm. Are you attempting to present the Council with a fait accompli? Oh no, Cross said. That would be presumptuous. This is more of a fait almost accompli. We're prepared to implement the plan if you approve it, but we're also prepared to cancel everything if you don't. And if we refuse? Cross's expression didn't change, but somehow the temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. Then you continue with your current approach, and we go back to Earth and explain to our government that the galactic community prefers the status quo. There was something in the way he said status quo that made it sound like a particularly unpleasant medical condition. And then what? Aleksandra asked. Then we find something else to do with our time. The implications of that statement hung in the air like a particularly ominous cloud. When humans got bored, things tended to explode, sometimes literally. Ythagarin looked around the chamber again. The calculations going on behind his fellow counselors' eyes were almost visible. On one hand, giving humans unprecedented authority over a critical region of space was probably insane. On the other hand, the current situation was already insane, and at least this would be a different kind of insane. On the third hand, and several species present actually had 3 hands, bored humans were historically bad for galactic stability. The Council, Ythagarin announced, will recess for deliberation. Excellent, Cross said, rising from his chair with the sort of fluid motion that reminded everyone present that humans were technically predators. I'll be in the diplomatic quarters if you need me. As the human ambassador walked out of the chamber, the counselors watched him go with expressions ranging from fascination to terror. Well, Brixtel said finally, that was interesting. That was insane, Zixthala corrected. Yes, Brixtel agreed. Interestingly insane. The council deliberated for exactly 4 hours and 37 minutes, which was either a record for quick decision-making or a sign that everyone involved had collectively decided to embrace madness. When Cross returned to the chamber, He found the counselors arranged in their seats with expressions that suggested they'd all simultaneously realized they were about to do something profoundly stupid, and had decided to do it anyway. "Human Cross," Ythgarin announced. "The Council has reached a decision." "I'm listening." "By a vote of 8 in favor, 6 against, and 3 abstentions, the Council hereby grants Earth provisional administrative authority over the neutral zone, subject to review in 1 standard year." Cross nodded as if he'd been expecting exactly that result. "Provisional authority is acceptable. When do we start?" "Immediately," Thexvar rumbled. "The sooner this experiment begins, the sooner we'll know if it's going to work, or if we need to start evacuating neighboring systems." "Fair enough," Cross said. Then he smiled, and for the first time since entering the chamber, it looked genuinely warm. "Thank you, counselors. You won't regret this decision." "We're already regretting it," Zixthala muttered. "But you're doing it anyway. That takes courage." "Or stupidity," Mexandra observed. "Often the same thing," Cross agreed. "If you'll excuse me, I have some calls to make." As the human ambassador left the chamber for the second time that day, the counselors sat in contemplative silence. Finally, Ythgarin spoke. "Did we just make the best decision in council history or the worst?" "Yes," said Brixtel. 3 days later, the first human administrative vessel arrived in the neutral zone. It wasn't quite what anyone had been expecting. For one thing, it was smaller than most species would have considered adequate for managing a region of space containing 14 major shipping routes, 47 inhabited systems, and roughly 6 million civilian vessels in transit at any given time. For another, it looked like someone had taken a standard diplomatic courier and decided to see what would happen if you bolted extra engines, sensor arrays, and communications equipment to every available surface. The result was something that looked less like a proper administrative vessel and more like someone's very ambitious hobby project. Which, as it turned out, was exactly what it was. Captain Elena Vasquez brought her ship, officially designated the EAS Improvisation, unofficially known as that thing Elena built in her garage, into position at the geometric center of the neutral zone, and began the process of establishing humanity's first galactic administrative outpost. The process mostly involved broadcasting a message on all available frequencies that said simply, "Hello, neutral zone. We're your new management. Please stand by for further instructions." The response was immediate, overwhelming, and about what you'd expect from 6 million beings who'd just been informed that their carefully regulated lives were now under the supervision of the species that had somehow managed to turn competitive eating into a spectator sport. "Captain," reported Lieutenant Commander Ryan Webb from the communications station, "we're receiving approximately, well, all of them. We're receiving all of the messages." "All of what messages?" "All of the messages. From everyone. Apparently the entire zone wants to talk to us right now." Vasquez looked at her tactical display, which showed the location of every major vessel, station, and installation in their area of responsibility. The screen looked like someone had spilled glitter on a star map. "Right," she said. "Webb, set up a general response protocol. Anyone who wants to complain about the change in management gets routed to Davies. Anyone with actual administrative issues gets routed to Torres. Anyone who sounds like they're planning something violent gets routed to me. And anyone who just wants to chat? Routed to Mitchell. He likes meeting new people." From his position at the navigation station, Ensign David Mitchell looked up with the expression of someone who'd just been volunteered for something he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to do. "Captain, I should point out that I don't actually speak most of the languages we're likely to encounter." "That's fine," Vasquez said. "Most of them don't speak human either. Just smile and nod until they figure out what they actually need." "That seems problematic." "Mitchell, we're humans attempting to administer a region of space using a ship that was literally built in someone's garage. Everything about this situation is problematic. We're just going to make it work anyway." Mitchell considered this logic and found it oddly reassuring. Over the next several hours, the crew of the Improvisation began to get a sense of exactly what they'd gotten themselves into. The neutral zone, it turned out, was less of a functional administrative region, and more of a carefully maintained disaster that had somehow achieved equilibrium. Trade routes overlapped in patterns that defied both logic and physics. Shipping schedules existed in a state of quantum uncertainty where cargo could be simultaneously late, early, and lost until someone actually bothered to observe it. And the various regulatory frameworks governing everything from customs inspections to parking permits had evolved into a bureaucratic ecosystem so complex that it had achieved something approaching sentience. "Captain," reported Lieutenant Anna Torres from the administrative station, "I've been reviewing the existing regulatory structure, and I think I understand why the previous management approach wasn't working." "Hit me." There are currently 47,632 different regulations governing commerce in the zone. Of those, approximately 38,000 are contradictory, 6,000 are physically impossible to comply with, and the remaining 3,000 and change apply only to species that have been extinct for at least 2 centuries. Vasquez stared at her. You're joking. I really wish I were, Captain. It gets worse. How could it possibly get worse? The regulations are updated on a rotating schedule managed by each of the 14 major powers. However, the update schedules don't synchronize, which means that at any given time, there are between 6 and 12 different versions of the regulatory framework in effect, depending on which sector you're in and what day of the week it is, according to whichever species calendar you happen to be using. Vasquez sat down heavily in her command chair. Torres, in your professional opinion as someone who actually understands how bureaucracies work, how should we handle this? Honestly, Captain, I think we should just ignore all of it and make up our own rules. Is that legal? Probably not. But I don't think anyone will notice for at least 6 months. And by then we'll either have fixed everything or been court-martialed. Works for me, Vasquez said. Webb, draft a message to all vessels in the zone. New regulatory framework goes into effect immediately. What regulatory framework? The one we're going to make up in the next... Vasquez checked her chronometer. 20 minutes. Torres, you're in charge of that. Keep it simple. How simple? Simple enough that a sleep-deprived cargo hauler can understand it without needing a legal degree. Torres looked thoughtful. That is simple. Good. Davies, what's our complaint situation looking like? Commander Lisa Davies looked up from her workstation, where she'd been handling what appeared to be a constant stream of incoming communications. Well, the good news is that most of the complaints are about the same few issues. The bad news is that those issues are... She paused to consult her notes. Fundamentally unsolvable, completely insane, or involve physics that I'm pretty sure don't work that way. Example? The Kethmori are complaining that the new trade route through Sector 12 violates their traditional right to control all commerce involving crystalline energy matrices. The Zephyrians are counter-complaining that the Kethmori definition of crystalline energy matrices includes basically everything, including sunlight. And the Veltar are complaining that both sides are generating negative emotional vibrations that are disrupting their meditation schedules. Vasquez rubbed her temples. And the physics-defying complaint? There's apparently a cargo hauler in Sector 8 that's simultaneously in 3 different locations, which is causing problems with the automated traffic control systems. How is something in 3 different locations? Near as I can tell, it's a side effect of the quantum navigation systems interacting with localized gravitational anomalies caused by the Nexari trying to solve some sort of mathematical proof using stellar engineering. Vasquez looked around the bridge of her improvised command ship and made a decision that would, in retrospect, define humanity's approach to galactic administration for the next several centuries. Right, she said. Here's what we're going to do. Davies, tell the Kethmori and Zephyrians that they can settle their trade dispute however they like, but they have to do it quietly. Webb, send a message to the Veltar meditation facilities offering to relocate their loudest neighbors to somewhere more peaceful. Torres, draft regulations that specifically require all vessels to exist in only one location at a time, unless they have a really good reason not to. And Mitchell. Yes, Captain. Find out if the Nexari need help with their math problem. If we're going to have impossible physics in our jurisdiction, we might as well make sure they're doing it safely. Mitchell looked uncertain. Captain, I should mention that I don't actually understand Nexari mathematics. That's fine. Neither do they, most of the time. Just be supportive. Word of humanity's novel approach to galactic administration spread through the neutral zone with the speed of particularly juicy gossip. Within 6 hours, the improvisation was receiving communications from species that hadn't talked to galactic authorities in decades, mostly because they'd assumed that anyone representing galactic authorities would be too sensible to actually listen to their problems. They were, it turned out, completely correct about the sensible part. Captain, Mitchell reported, I've got a delegation of Harathi merchants on the line. They want to know if our new regulations cover temporal shipping. Temporal shipping? Apparently they've figured out how to deliver cargo before it's actually shipped. It's very efficient, but it's causing problems with the customs forms. Vasquez considered this. Are they making money? Lots, apparently. Are they hurting anyone? Not as far as I can tell. The worst side effect seems to be that customers sometimes receive their orders before they place them, which mostly just confuses the billing department. Tell them temporal shipping is fine as long as they promise not to deliver anything to last Tuesday. We're not dealing with temporal paradoxes on our first week. Understood, Captain. Meanwhile, at the administrative station, Torres was discovering that the human approach to bureaucracy was somehow both more and less complicated than what it was replacing. The new regulatory framework, she reported, consists of 17 rules, all of which fit on a single page. So far, compliance is running at about 97%, which is approximately 95% higher than the previous system. What about the other 3%? Mostly ships that are still trying to figure out which set of 47,000 regulations they're supposed to be following. I've been telling them not to worry about it.
Does that work? Surprisingly well. Turns out most people just want someone to tell them it's okay to get on with their lives.
At the tactical station, Webb was handling what had initially appeared to be a series of potential diplomatic incidents, but were turning out to be mostly social problems. The situation in Sector 15 has been resolved, he reported. Turns out the Keth Mori and Zephyrian trade vessels weren't actually fighting over shipping rights. They were fighting over who got to use the good rest stop. There's only one rest stop in Sector 15? Apparently it's the only one in 3 sectors that serves decent food and doesn't charge extra for non-standard atmospheric requirements. I've designated it a neutral facility and set up a reservation system. A reservation system? It seemed like the obvious solution. Now everyone knows when they can stop for lunch and there's no more fighting. Vasquez was beginning to suspect that galactic politics might be less complicated than everyone had led her to believe. Davies, she said, what's our complaint status? Down by about 70%. Most of the remaining issues are getting resolved by telling people to talk to each other instead of filing formal grievances. That works? Apparently most of the irreconcilable differences between various species are actually just misunderstandings caused by the fact that nobody was bothering to explain what they actually wanted. Huh. Captain Vasquez looked around her bridge, taking in the displays showing a region of space that was, for the first time in centuries, functioning more or less like it was supposed to. You know, she said, I was expecting this to be a lot harder. Back on the council station, the news of humanity's early success in the neutral zone was being received with reactions ranging from surprise to existential confusion. They did what with the temporal shipping? Ithgaran asked, reviewing the latest reports with the expression of someone whose carefully ordered universe was being systematically dismantled. Legalized it, Zixathala reported, her crystalline features cycling through colors that indicated deep confusion. Apparently their position is that if something works and doesn't hurt anyone, there's no reason to make it illegal. That's, Thexvar rumbled slowly, actually sensible. That's what's so disturbing about it. Counselor Aleksandra reviewed her own reports with growing bewilderment. The Velatar meditation facilities are reporting unprecedented levels of spiritual harmony. Apparently having their complaints actually addressed instead of being processed through bureaucratic channels for 6 months has had a significant positive impact on their emotional well-being. And the trade situation? Asked Brixtel. Commerce is up 18% across all major routes. Apparently when you don't need a team of lawyers to understand the shipping regulations, people are more willing to do business. High Counselor Yithagaran sat back in his chair and contemplated the reports. By every measurable metric, the neutral zone was functioning better under human administration than it had in living memory. This was, he realized, either the best news he'd received in decades, or a sign that the universe had fundamentally broken in some subtle but profound way. Counselors, he said finally, I think we need to consider the possibility that we may have been approaching galactic administration incorrectly. How do you mean? Zixthala asked. I mean that perhaps the problem with the neutral zone wasn't that it was inherently unmanageable. Perhaps the problem was that we were trying to manage it using methods designed for species that actually want to follow rules. The silence that followed this observation was the sort that typically accompanies profound philosophical revelations or severe mental breakdowns. Are you suggesting, Thexvar said slowly, that humans are better at galactic administration than we are? I'm suggesting, Yithgaran replied, that humans are better at dealing with chaos than we are. And since galactic politics is mostly chaos, that may actually be the most important qualification. Mexandra's harmonious voice carried a note of what might have been horror. You're saying that their approach is working because they don't expect things to make sense? I'm saying their approach is working because they don't need things to make sense in order to deal with them. The counselors considered this disturbing possibility. So what do we do? Asked Brixtel. We wait, Yithgaran said, and we learn. 3 weeks into humanity's administration of the neutral zone, Captain Vasquez received a priority communication from Ambassador Cross. Elena, he said, appearing on the main screen with an expression that suggested either very good news or very bad news. How are things going out there? Better than expected, honestly. We've resolved most of the major trade disputes, streamlined the bureaucracy, and I think we've accidentally invented 3 new forms of interspecies diplomacy. Accidentally? Well, Mitchell figured out that if you just ask people what they actually want, instead of what they're officially supposed to want, most problems solve themselves. Torres discovered that most regulations can be replaced with "don't be an asshole," and if you're not sure whether something counts as being an asshole, ask someone. And Davies has been resolving disputes by making people sit in the same room and talk until they work it out. Cross looked impressed. Any major problems? Define major. Anything likely to start a war? Not so far. We did have one incident where a Nexari mathematician tried to prove that space had the wrong number of dimensions, but we talked him out of it by offering to help him publish his paper in a peer-reviewed journal instead of demonstrating his thesis using live stellar engineering. That's probably for the best. Oh, definitely. His math was actually pretty solid, but changing the fundamental structure of local space-time seemed like it would create unnecessary paperwork. Cross was quiet for a moment. Elena, I need you to know that what you're doing out there is being watched very carefully by the entire galactic community. Good carefully or bad carefully? Both. The Council is amazed by your results, but they're also trying to figure out if humans are some sort of administrative savants, or if we just got lucky. Vasquez considered this. What do you think? I think, Cross said carefully, that we're good at this because we don't approach it like a problem to be solved. We approach it like a situation to be managed. Is there a difference? All the difference in the galaxy. When you try to solve a problem, you need to understand all the variables and find the optimal solution. When you manage a situation, you just need to keep things moving in a generally positive direction while adapting to whatever comes up. And that works because galactic politics isn't a problem with a solution. It's an ongoing situation that needs constant adjustment. And humans, as it turns out, are really good at constant adjustment. Vasquez looked around her bridge, where her crew was handling a steady stream of communications, requests, and minor crises with the sort of casual competence that came from 3 weeks of figuring things out as they went along. Daniel, she said, are you telling me that we're succeeding because we're making it up as we go? I'm telling you that you're succeeding because you're good at making it up as you go. There's a difference. Is there? Sure. Anyone can improvise. Not everyone can improvise well. Before Vasquez could respond, Mitchell called out from his station. Captain, we've got an incoming priority message from the Council. They're requesting a full status report on zone administration. Vasquez looked at Cross. Think they're happy with our work? I think, Cross said with a slight smile. They're about to offer you a permanent position. The Council's request for a status report turned out to be something of an understatement. What they actually wanted was a complete briefing on human administrative methods, delivered in person to the full Council Assembly, which was how Captain Vasquez found herself standing in the same chamber where Cross had made his original proposal, facing the same collection of alien dignitaries who had agreed to let humans try their hand at galactic administration. The difference was that this time, nobody looked like they thought the humans had suffered a catastrophic head injury. Captain Vasquez, High Counselor Yith Garin announced, the Council has reviewed your preliminary reports on zone administration. We would like to understand your methods. Happy to explain, Vasquez said, settling into the same awkward chair that Cross had occupied. What would you like to know? How? Counselor Zixthala asked. Did you resolve the Kethmori-Zephyrian trade dispute that has been ongoing for 37 years? Oh, that. Vasquez looked slightly embarrassed. That wasn't actually a trade dispute. They were arguing about who got to use the premium docking facilities at Station Gamma 7. The silence that followed suggested that several counselors were reconsidering some fundamental assumptions about the nature of interspecies conflict. The premium docking facilities, Thexvar repeated slowly. Right. See, Station Gamma 7 has 12 docking bays. 6 of them have standard amenities, basic power, standard atmosphere, that sort of thing. But 6 of them have what you might call luxury accommodations. Better power systems, customizable atmospheric controls, even entertainment feeds. And both species wanted access to these facilities? Both species assumed the other species was trying to deny them access to these facilities. Turns out nobody had bothered to set up a reservation system, so it was first come, first served, which meant whoever showed up first got the good spots and everyone else got resentful. Counselor Aleksandra leaned forward slightly. And your solution? Alternating priority access based on a rotating schedule, with premium slots allocated proportionally based on usage patterns. Basically, if you use the station a lot, you get more premium time slots, but everyone gets at least some. That's... Ithgaren paused, clearly running calculations. That's actually a very sophisticated resource allocation algorithm. Is it? Vasquez looked genuinely surprised. We just called it taking turns like civilized beings. The counselors exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand something about human administrative philosophy. What about the Veltar meditation crisis? Asked Aleksandra. Oh, that was easier. They were complaining about emotional disruption caused by industrial activities in neighboring sectors. So we asked the industrial operations if they could reschedule their noisiest work for times when the meditation facilities weren't in session. And they agreed? Sure. Most of the noisy work was stuff like cargo loading and engine testing, things that don't have to happen at specific times. Once everyone knew when to be quiet and when they could make noise, the problem solved itself. You coordinated the industrial schedules of 14 different species? We asked them to coordinate their own schedules. We just provided a common calendar and asked everyone to mark their preferred quiet times and their preferred noisy times. Brickstell leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone whose worldview was undergoing rapid reconstruction. Captain Vasquez, are you telling us that most of the conflicts in the neutral zone were caused by simple scheduling conflicts? Not exactly, Vasquez said, but a lot of them were caused by people making assumptions about other people's motivations, instead of just asking what they actually wanted. Explain. Well, take the temporal shipping thing. The Harathi merchants had figured out how to deliver cargo before it was shipped, which is genuinely impressive, but they were afraid to register their technique officially because they assumed it would be illegal. Was it illegal? Nobody knew. The existing regulations didn't cover temporal mechanics, because nobody had thought to write regulations for something that seemed impossible. So instead of asking for clarification, the Harathi were operating in a legal gray area, and the customs authorities were getting frustrated because they couldn't figure out how to process shipments that arrived before they were sent. Thexvar rumbled thoughtfully. And your solution? We made it legal, with the condition that they had to file their temporal shipping manifests in temporal order from the perspective of the receiving party. So if you're delivering something to next Tuesday, you file the paperwork next Tuesday, even if you're shipping it this Thursday. Does that work? Perfectly. The Harathi are happy because they can operate legally. The customs people are happy because the paperwork makes sense. And everyone else is happy because temporal shipping is really efficient. The silence that followed was the sort that typically accompanies the realization that you've been overthinking something for several decades. Captain? Ithgaren said finally. How long did it take you to develop these solutions? Which ones? All of them. Vasquez thought about it. Most of them came up during our first week. We'd get a complaint, figure out what people actually wanted, and then work out a way to give it to them. Just like that? Well, we had to be creative sometimes. The quantum cargo situation took a while to sort out. The quantum cargo situation? Right. The ship that was in 3 places at once. Turns out it wasn't actually in 3 places at once. It was in 1 place. But that place was moving through 3 different dimensional coordinates simultaneously because of some experimental navigation technology. And you resolved this how? We asked the Nexari to help us write navigation software that could track multi-dimensional positioning. They were excited to have a practical application for some of their theoretical work. So the ship that was everywhere at once is now the most precisely trackable vessel in the zone. The navigation software they developed is so good that other ships are asking to license it. Counselor Zixthala's crystalline features went through several colors that suggested deep confusion. Captain Vasquez, are you telling us that you turned a physics-defying navigation disaster into a commercial opportunity? We turned a problem into a solution that worked for everyone involved. Whether that counts as a commercial opportunity depends on your perspective. The counselors sat in contemplative silence, trying to process the idea that 3 weeks of human administration had accomplished more than 6 centuries of traditional galactic diplomacy. Finally, Aleksandra spoke. Captain, what do you believe is the fundamental difference between human administrative methods and traditional council approaches? Vasquez considered the question carefully. I think, she said, the main difference is that we don't assume things have to be complicated. Elaborate. Well, traditional galactic administration seems to be based on the idea that complex problems require complex solutions. But most problems aren't actually complex. They're just situations where people want different things, and nobody's bothered to figure out how to give everyone what they want. And when people want things that are mutually exclusive, that happens less often than you'd think. Usually what looks like mutually exclusive desires turns out to be people wanting the same thing but describing it differently, or people wanting different things that don't actually conflict with each other. Thexvar leaned forward. Example? The Kethmori wanted exclusive control over crystalline energy matrix commerce. The Zephyrians wanted unrestricted access to quantum navigation markets. Both sides thought these were contradictory demands. Were they? Nope. The Kethmori wanted to be the primary suppliers of crystalline energy matrices. The Zephyrians wanted to be able to buy quantum navigation systems without jumping through bureaucratic hoops. So we set up a system where the Kethmori got preferred supplier status for energy matrices, and the Zephyrians got streamlined purchasing procedures for navigation tech. And both sides were satisfied? Both sides were thrilled. The Kethmori got the commercial advantage they wanted. The Zephyrians got the administrative simplicity they wanted, and trade volume increased for everyone. Ithgarin looked around the chamber, taking in the expressions of his fellow counselors. Captain Vasquez, the council has a proposal for you. I'm listening. We would like to offer Earth permanent administrative authority over the neutral zone, with an expansion of your jurisdiction to include coordination of interspecies trade disputes throughout council space. Vasquez blinked. That's a significant expansion. The results speak for themselves. Trade efficiency is up, conflicts are down, and for the first time in living memory, the various species in the zone are actually cooperating with each other. What would this expanded role involve? Essentially, Zixthala said, you would become the galaxy's arbitrators. When species have disputes they can't resolve themselves, they would bring them to you for mediation. Why us? Because, Thexvar rumbled, you're the only species that seems to be able to get everyone else to stop arguing and start talking. Vasquez looked thoughtful. I'd need to discuss this with my government, but speaking personally, I think we'd be interested. Excellent, Ithgarin said. There is one condition, however, which is, we want to understand your methods well enough to train other species in human-style administration. Would you be willing to establish some sort of educational exchange program? You want us to teach other species how to think like humans? We want to learn how to solve problems by not assuming they're impossible to solve. Vasquez smiled. That, I think, we can do. 6 months later, the first class of the Galactic Administrative Academy graduated from what had become known, somewhat inevitably, as Human School. The curriculum was unconventional, to say the least. Instead of studying traditional diplomatic protocols, students learned what humans called active listening, the radical concept of actually paying attention to what people said they wanted instead of what you assumed they wanted. Instead of memorizing complex regulatory frameworks, students practiced creative problem-solving, the apparently revolutionary idea that if something wasn't working, you should try something else. And instead of focusing on interspecies cultural differences, students studied what humans called universal needs assessment. The shocking discovery that most sentient beings wanted basically the same things: to be heard, to be respected, and to get on with their lives without unnecessary complications. The first graduating class included representatives from 12 different species, all of whom had spent 6 months learning to think like humans. The results were, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. Conflicts that had been simmering for decades were resolved in weeks. Trade disputes that had required years of mediation were settled in days. And throughout council space, a new approach to galactic administration was taking hold. One based on the radical premise that most problems had solutions, and most solutions were simpler than anyone had imagined. Captain Vasquez, who had been promoted to admiral and given command of the newly established Galactic Mediation Service, stood in her office aboard the GMS Resolution, a purpose-built command vessel that was significantly more impressive than the garage-built improvisation, but retained the same spirit of practical innovation, and looked out at a region of space that was, for the first time in recorded history, actually working the way it was supposed to. Her comm system chimed with an incoming message from Ambassador Cross, who had been appointed as Earth's permanent representative to the Council. Elena, he said, appearing on her screen with a satisfied expression. I just wanted to let you know. The Council has officially adopted human administrative methods as the standard approach for all interspecies mediation. How do they feel about that? Confused, mostly. They keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. Is there another shoe? Not that I can see. It turns out that when you treat galactic politics like a collection of solvable problems, instead of an inevitable source of conflict, it actually becomes a collection of solvable problems. Vasquez laughed. Who would have thought? Apparently just us. The other species are still trying to figure out how we made it look so easy. Should we tell them? Tell them what? That it actually is easy, most of the time. Cross was quiet for a moment. You know, Elena, I don't think they'd believe us. Probably not, she agreed. Good thing we don't need them to believe us. We just need them to keep letting us fix things. Think they will? Look around, Vasquez said, gesturing at her displays showing trade routes running smoothly, conflicts being resolved through mediation instead of warfare, and species that had been enemies for centuries actually working together on common projects. Would you fire the people who made this possible? Point taken. As Cross signed off, Vasquez turned back to her work, a steady stream of requests for mediation, arbitration, and what had become known throughout the galaxy as human-style problem-solving. She smiled as she reviewed the day's requests. A dispute over mining rights that could probably be resolved by asking both sides what they actually needed the minerals for. A trade route conflict that sounded like another scheduling problem. A cultural misunderstanding between two species, who apparently both wanted the same thing, but were expressing it in ways that made it sound like they wanted opposite things. Just another day of making the galaxy work better by assuming it was supposed to work in the first place. Outside her office, the stars continued their ancient dance, but for the first time in anyone's memory, the civilizations that lived among them were dancing in harmony, instead of stepping on each other's feet. And in the diplomatic archives of a dozen different species, historians would note that the transformation had begun with a single human ambassador walking into the council chamber and making a proposal that everyone assumed was insane. Right up until it worked. Epilogue. 5 years later. The Galactic Council's annual address was, traditionally, a formal affair involving lengthy speeches about cooperation, mutual understanding, and the importance of maintaining galactic stability through careful diplomacy. This year's address was being delivered by High Counselor Yithgarin, and it was notably shorter than usual. Fellow beings, he announced to the assembled representatives of 47 different species. I am pleased to report that this year marks the 5th consecutive year of decreased interspecies conflict, increased trade efficiency, and general galactic stability. Polite applause rippled through the chamber. These improvements, Yithgarin continued, are the direct result of our adoption of what has become known as the human method of galactic administration. An approach based on the revolutionary premise that most problems have solutions, and most solutions are simpler than we expect them to be. The applause was slightly less polite this time, mostly because half the representatives were still getting used to the idea that humans had accidentally solved galactic politics. I am also pleased to announce, Yithgarin said, that the Galactic Mediation Service, under the leadership of Admiral Vasquez, has successfully resolved over 10,000 interspecies disputes using techniques that can best be summarized as talking to people until everyone figures out what they actually want. A representative from the back of the chamber called out, High Counselor, what do you attribute this success to? Yithgarin considered the question. I believe, he said finally, that humans succeeded where we failed because they approached galactic administration as a service industry rather than a regulatory system. Meaning? Meaning they focused on helping people get what they wanted rather than preventing them from doing what we didn't want them to do. The chamber fell quiet as the assembled representatives considered this distinction. In conclusion, Yithgarin said, I believe the lesson of the past 5 years is that sometimes the best way to solve a complicated problem is to stop assuming it has to be complicated. He paused, then added with what might have been a smile. Or, as Admiral Vasquez put it in her latest report, turns out most people just want to get along. Our job is to help them figure out how. As the council session concluded and the representatives filed out to return to their respective worlds, the conversation in the corridors was notably different from what it had been 5 years earlier. Instead of complaints about bureaucratic inefficiency and irreconcilable differences, the talk was of new trade partnerships, successful joint projects, and the kind of interspecies cooperation that had once seemed impossible. And somewhere in the neutral zone, aboard a ship that had evolved from someone's garage project into the flagship of galactic mediation, Admiral Elena Vasquez was already working on tomorrow's problems, confident in the knowledge that most of them weren't really problems at all. They were just situations that needed a little human attention. End of story. Author's note. Sometimes the best way to change the galaxy is to stop assuming it can't be changed. Sometimes the best diplomacy is just asking people what they actually want. And sometimes the most advanced civilizations in the universe need to learn from the species that figured out how to make things work by assuming they're supposed to work in the first place.
Humanity, fuck yeah.
More like, humanity, let's just try talking to each other and see what happens. Turns out what happens is pretty good.